Thank you for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So I wanted to introduce David Hughes, our key speaker in terms of talking about the reports that the Post-Carbon Institute has just published. But before I do that, I think it might be useful to provide a little bit of context. Post-Carbon Institute and Dave have been actually tracking the progress, if you want to call it that, of the fracking boom since 2011, so it's been almost 6 years now. And we first started doing that work because we were actually having conversations with some environmental funders who were supporting and promoting the idea of natural gas being a bridge from coal to a renewable energy future. And we were puzzled by some of the assumptions that we were hearing about how much natural gas was out there. So we reached out to Dave to see if he could do a little bit of analysis looking at that, and he also looked at what the climate impacts might be from fracked gas versus coal production. And since that point, he's been doing a series of ongoing reports. The most comprehensive one was done a couple of years ago called Drilling Deeper, which did a play-by-play analysis of both shale gas and tight oil in the United States. Doing a deep dive, looking at actual production data from the field, and then comparing that data and his own sense of what might be the most likely scenario to play out against what the Energy Information Administration was putting out there. And since that point, we've been publishing an update every year. This is the second year in a row that we've done an update, sort of looking at both what's happening out in these plays and comparing it to what the Energy Information Administration has been telling us. And the reason that that matters so much is that the Energy Information Administration is actually one of the very few departments of the United States government that has complete freedom and autonomy, at least in theory, to develop its own research and publications, even though it's part of the Department of Energy. And a lot of people, I think as a result of that, look to them as a unbiased, non-political agency that's just putting out data and analysis and projections. And they do a great job of collecting data. They don't do quite so good of a job with their projections for future production. But unfortunately, policymakers and mainstream media sort of take their numbers without much skepticism. So we've been sort of looking at what the EIA has said and have found over the years that they are highly optimistic, which Dave will talk about in more detail. We did find that at times they can ratchet back some of their enthusiasm. A few years ago, Dave did an analysis looking at the Monterey Shale formation here in California, where Post-Carbon Institute is based, and at the time it was considered to have something like 2/3 of all the technically recoverable tight oil in the country, and so there was a lot of hype about the potential of the Monterey to create tons of jobs and boost the California economy and help provide energy independence for the United States. And Dave's report on California basically brought a lot of doubt to that estimate, and a few months later the EIA actually reduced their estimates by 96%. So we found it useful to try to counter some of the hype and to have people asking questions of the EIA. So I will let Dave talk about the latest update in his reports. Just a quick introduction of him. Dave is a neuroscience scientist based in Canada who's been studying energy resources in Canada and over the last decade or so, in the U.S. as well, for about four decades, including 32 years with the Geological Survey of Canada as a scientist and research manager. He's done a lot of work looking at coal inventories, but also at unconventional gas in Canada. He continues to do a lot of publishing and research looking at the situation in Canada. For those of you who are interested, looking at the pipeline situations up there, and also the whole idea of doing LNG exports up there. But Dave has done tremendous work looking at U.S. shale resources as well, and so we feel very fortunate to be able to work with him and list him among Post-Carbon Institute fellows. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave.
Okay, thanks very much, Asher. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to do the next slide thing. And let's start that off. Next slide. Great. Yeah, so what I'd like to do is just quickly touch on basically key findings from the two reports that we just published about a week or so ago. Look at one play from each report just to give you an idea of what's in the reports, and then summarize the implications of what all that means. So in terms of key findings, as Asher mentioned, we found that the three series of reports we looked at, the Annual Energy Outlook 2014, 2015, and 2016, which are produced each year by the EIA, are invariably extremely optimistic. This year's report, for example, projects shale gas to grow by 136% from 2014 to 2040, and tight oil to grow by 65% by 2040. We looked at that on a play level basis just to see what it was that made that up, and we found that it was extremely optimistic. In order to do this, the EIA projects that over 1 million wells will need to be drilled by 2040. At an average of $6 million each, that would mean $6 trillion in capital outlay between 2014 and 2040. We found that the forecasts become ever more optimistic year after year. For example, this year's forecasts are up 19% for tight oil and 31% for shale gas over last year. What's more, the production is projected to grow while prices remain low, well below last year's estimates, and drilling rates remain below 2014 levels through 2040. Next slide. The play level forecasts are also very volatile between years, usually on the upside, and often recover more improved resources than the EIA's own estimates say are known to exist. Production in all major plays reviewed has peaked with the exception of 2 Permian Basin tight oil plays. Tight oil overall is down 13% and shale gas is down 5%. Tight oil peaked in March 2015 overall, and shale gas peaked in February 2016. Production through 2040 is highly weighted to a few key plays. For example, half of the shale gas production comes from the Marcellus and the Haynesville, the Marcellus being responsible for over 1/3 of the projected production, and half of tight oil production comes from the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, with the Bakken responsible for 1/3 of it. So the whole concept that shale is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, is really not true. There's a few very good plays, and you know, it's definitely a finite resource. Next slide. Yeah, just refer to shalebubble.org, and all of these reports and all of the earlier reports are to be found there for downloading. Next slide. So for my work on shale over the last few years, what's developed is a pattern which I call the shale play life cycle. Discovery, followed by a leasing frenzy. It really got started in East Texas in the Barnett play in the late 90s, and there's been many plays discovered since then. Invariably, once the play is discovered, there's a leasing frenzy as people try to tie up the land. There's a drilling boom that follows the leasing frenzy. In order to hold those leases, you really have to drill them within usually within 3 to 5 years in order to hold the land. Sweet spots are identified, targeted, and drilled off early on in the play. And typically, although plays may be large, they always have a core area or sweet spot, which is usually 15 to 20% of the total play area. Production rises rapidly and is maintained for cash flow, despite the fact that you may not have drilled those wells if you knew the full cycle economics. And we've seen a lot of debt associated with shale, and a lot of companies have gone out of business in the recent past because of the low oil and gas prices. A key factor of shale is that wells decline very quickly, typically 75 to 85% in the first 3 years, and often 65 to 70% in the first year. So you need to keep drilling in order to overcome the field production decline. And if you add in old wells and new wells, typically the average field declines at 30 to 45% per year, which has to be replaced by more drilling. Sweet spots become saturated, and well quality and field production decline. Plays like the Haynesville, the Barnett, which was the first one, become middle-aged after just a few years. Next slide. This is the Haynesville in East Texas and Louisiana, which is really a poster child for the shale play life cycle. Discovered in 2007, followed by a leasing and a drilling boom. It peaked in November 2011, and it's now down about 50% from peak, with about 3,500 wells drilled. Next slide. This is an example of what I mean by sweet spots. The red wells in the play are really the highest initial productivity wells, the highest quality wells that will produce the most gas. And that grades downward to the green and ultimately the black. So you drill the red areas first, and you have to deal with a much larger portion of the play that has much lower productivity wells. So it takes a lot more money and a lot more wells in order to maintain production as time goes by. Next slide. This is an example of the Barnett where it got started. Tarrant County is really in the center of the sweet spot, and it's now drilled off to about 8 wells per square mile, which is essentially saturation. So new drilling is going into poor quality rock, lower productivity wells, more capital input, and more drilling in order to keep production up. The Barnett's down about 30% since it peaked in 2011. Next slide. This is the projection of the EIA in its latest forecast, and it's basically calling for 136% growth in shale gas production through 2040. So shale gas is really the only prospect for growing U.S. gas production at this point. They're suggesting that production will keep growing, and 18% of production will be exported as LNG by 2040. So very bullish and optimistic forecast. The dotted line is price. The price of gas right now is about $3.50 a million BTUs. They're projecting it will rise to $5 in about 2025 and stay there for the next 15 years, which is, again, extremely optimistic. Next slide. This is the play-by-play forecast from that previous slide, just for shale. And in essence, you can see how aggressive the growth is. And you can look at the earlier forecast, 2015 and 2014. And as I mentioned, they just keep getting more aggressive as we go forward. Next slide. This is actual production of shale gas by play through August of 2016. As I mentioned, shale gas peaked in February of 2016, and it's now down about 5%. The Marcellus is really the big one. Concerns a lot of you people out in the eastern U.S. Next slide. This is the EIA's forecast for the Marcellus, looking at this year's and the previous 2 years. The Marcellus peaked in February 2016. It doesn't look like it here. That's because this data is on an annual basis, not a monthly basis. But in essence, the EIA is suggesting that 215 trillion cubic feet of gas will be recovered from 2014 to 2040. And their own estimates of how much gas is unproved technically recoverable is 148. So they're, in essence, suggesting that 147% of what they feel is technically recoverable will be recovered by 2040, and production will still be very high at that point in time. My projection is about 120 TCF over the same time period. Next slide. In keeping with what I said about sweet spots, the Marcellus is a very large play, but in fact 2 counties account for 37% of production, and 5 counties account for 65%. So even though these plays may be very large, the core areas are really the most important. And with the low prices, the core areas are being targeted and drilled off as we speak. Next slide. This is the variability between 2 years. This is the 2015 forecast compared to the 2016 forecast for years 2020, 25, 2030, 2035, and 2040. And you can see that in general, 30% plus variability is not uncommon. The only play that really went down here is the Eagle Ford. All the rest of them went up. And in total, most years went up by more than 30%. Next slide. This is the 2016 tight oil forecast of the EIA. And again, they're suggesting about a 65% growth in tight oil production. And again, tight oil is the only hope for growing U.S. oil production. All other sources of oil production are declining in essence. They're also suggesting that this production growth will occur at prices below $100 a barrel out through 2030. Next slide. Production by play. And as I mentioned, tight oil production peaked in March 2015. It's now down about 13%. As of June, it's down about 19% as of November. Next slide. A look at the tight oil production by play. And again, there's relatively few really good plays. The top 2 plays here, the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, account for 48% of production from 2014 through 2040. The top 3 plays account for 59%. Next slide. This is the Bakken, which according to the EIA will account for about 1/3 of all tight oil production from 2014 to 2040. Extremely aggressive, even compared to earlier years. My forecast from drilling deeper is in the purple. The amount of drilling that it would take to do this is, well, frankly, impossible. If you look at things like well quality, and how much capital you'd have to put into this play. So this is an extremely optimistic forecast. Next slide. Again, with respect to sweet spots, 2 counties in the Bakken Play have produced 54% of the oil, and 5 counties have produced 92% of it. And these top counties are being aggressively targeted as we speak, given the low price of oil. Next slide. Another look at the variability between these plays. Again, mostly on the upside. Some of these plays have been revised by over 200% in some years, just between two forecasts that were separated by 12 months. Next slide. This is the overall outlook for all oil and gas production in the U.S. Essentially, production is up overall. Conventional oil and gas are down, and shale gas and tight oil are up 88% collectively from 2014 through 2040. The dotted line is the number of wells drilled per year. You can see it hit about 47,000 wells per year in 2014. It dropped precipitously with the drop in rig counts. It's down about 37% from that 2014 peak now. And it's not projected to recover to the 2014 peak until 2040. And yet, a very aggressive growth in basically unconventional oil and gas production. Next slide. So just to look at what this means, EIA projections of long-term growth in tight oil and shale gas at low prices are extremely optimistic and highly questionable. This is a problem. Investments in infrastructure, power generation, export facilities, LNG exports, oil exports, and so forth are based on a belief that EIA forecasts provide a realistic view of future prices and supply. Incorrect projections result in wasted capital and lost opportunity and put long-term energy security at risk. Americans need to be certain that U.S. energy policy is based on realistic, independently sourced and transparent analysis rather than wishful thinking. And as Ashur mentioned, the EIA is supposedly a totally independent body, but we found that, as Ashur mentioned, they're very good at collecting data, but they're not very good at projecting future production trends. This is especially important given the views expressed by the transition team of the incoming Trump administration, who has suggested that the EIA's forecasts are far too conservative. You may have heard that the Department of Energy was presented with a list of 74 questions a couple weeks back, and one of those looked at the AEO forecast and suggested they were far too conservative. So that's a concern. Looking